Well, for this short, we're going to look at another one of my heroes from church history, Martin Luther. Martin Luther was born in 1483 in northern Germany, Mansfeld, and he grew up, excelled at school. He was a very clever lad, bright lad, and his parents wanted him to do very well, so they sent him to study law. That was the career path that they wanted for their son. And they sent him to Erfurt University. That's where he went to do his studies, did his BA and then his Masters in law, and did very well at that, excelled in his studies, was a bit of a musician during that time too. But then tragedy struck Erfurt, the plague. At the moment we're on lockdown, and so things are difficult, but things were terrifically difficult in those days in Europe. And so Martin Luther loses 3 of his close friends to plague, and obviously that has some impact on his view about life. And there's a famous story about him travelling home, and then he's on his way back to Erfurt, and there's a thunderstorm and lightning, and he's caught in this storm, and he's so terrified of dying. And I guess this is partly to do with the death that he's seen in recent days amongst his friends, and partly to do with his Roman Catholic upbringing, just terrified of dying and then going either to hell or to purgatory, as the Roman Catholic Church taught. And so he's terrified, and he falls to the ground, and he cries out to St. Anne, his patron saint, and he cries out to her, "Save me and I will become a monk." And that changed the direction of Martin Luther's life in many ways, the first event that really changed his life. On to the next segment of the story. Well, he begins life as a monk in Erfurt Monastery, the Augustinian monastery, and it's a hard life. So for 5 years he's there, 1505 to 1510, and going through all the rigorous routine of being a monk in a monastery, a hard life in many ways. And during that time, Martin Luther finds that his view of God and God's severity and holiness is really oppressive. So he finds himself in a really bad place spiritually, not finding much satisfaction in the life of the monastery. Until 1510, he's sent on a trip down to Rome. Now, this is not like a bus trip, this is a walking trip, so about 1,000 miles on foot down to Rome. And I guess for Martin it was an opportunity to see the very centre of religious life, hopefully find some answers to some of the issues that he was facing. But when he actually gets to Rome, he is overwhelmed at the mismatch between what he sees and what he knows of the Christian life from the monastery. He finds people who are really just out to make money, and lots of things that really upset him. And so he returns back to Erfurt in 1510 after this trip to Rome, and it's not been a good time for Martin, really. And that's when he gets sent to Wittenburg Monastery. And in Wittenberg he meets a senior monk called Staupitz, and Staupitz takes pity on Luther and decides to help him, and he understands Luther very well, really, in many ways, and is a good friend to Luther. So he suggests that he needs to do less confessing, because Martin is very serious about confessing every little detail of his life, and this is swirling him into this depression, really. Staupitz suggests that actually what the best thing to do would be for Martin to teach the Bible at the new university at Wittenberg. So he's appointed as a professor of the Bible, teaching at Wittenberg. And for the first time, Martin really has to engage with the text of the Bible. So it's not just the monastic life now, it's actually what does God say in the Bible. And as he's teaching through the Bible, he makes a staggering discovery. He finds that the Bible teaches that we're saved and we come into relationship with God through grace. It's a gift. God gives us that gift and we receive it by faith. So we're saved not by what we do, not by our achievements and attainments, but by God's free offer of salvation, which we receive by faith. And this is absolutely revolutionary for Martin, a real changing point in his life as he understands that God is not this ogre to be feared, but this gracious Father who offers salvation to those who come to him in faith. Now we switch scenes and we go back to Rome and to the Pope at the time, Leo X. Leo X was a bad man in many ways. And one of the things he did was use up all of the money that the Roman Catholic Church had, and so he had to work out a scheme to make more money. And to do this, he used a man called Johann Tetzel. Tetzel was a expert at manipulating and selling, and so he's a monk, and he has this scheme where he sells indulgences all over Europe, but particularly in Germany, interestingly, to raise money for the building projects back in Rome. So Tetzel arrives and he's selling these indulgences, and the problem is that Martin Luther, who has responsibility now not only for teaching but for caring for people in Erfurt, sees folk at the church there selling and using their money, their very little money, to buy these indulgences. And this absolutely incenses Martin Luther. And so he starts preaching against this, but then in 1517, very famously, he writes out 95 bullet points against the selling of indulgences and the practice of the church in the day. I don't think he's really trying to bring the church down, but he's just saying that things have gone wrong. We're a long way from where we should be. And these are written in Latin. They're nailed to the church door, and that's sort of a way of opening debate. It was a recognised way of opening debate, but it was pretty brutal stuff. And so Martin Luther lays out what he thinks is wrong at the moment and posts them on the door. Now, you need to remember that 70 years earlier, another German, Wittenburg, had invented the printing press. And so things could really dramatically change now because of that. So friends of Martin get hold of these 95 theses, translate them into German, it's printed, and it goes absolutely berserk. It goes everywhere. Everybody's reading these 95 theses. And what Martin starts out as just a protest in Erfurt spreads all over Germany, and in fact spreads right down to Rome, and they hear about it. The Pope, Leo X, is pretty incensed by this little German monk, lecturer, and so he issues this decree to Martin. He's got to retract these 95 theses. Martin, at this point, I mean, it must have been a pretty scary thing, but he really, this is Martin Luther all over. He really goes for it. So he says he's not going to take those back, and he's not going to retract his statements. And then a cardinal is sent to interview Martin Luther, and Martin, in pretty rude fashion, says that there was nothing much to him. He wasn't up to the job. He wasn't good enough to do the job of interviewing because he didn't understand the issues. And eventually this goes on, and it escalates really until such time that the Pope issues an excommunication to Martin Luther, and this is sent to him so that he'll be cut off from the church, he'll be eternally damned, and he'll be an outcast in this world too. Now Martin at this point ramps up his writing, and he writes a book called The Babylonian Captivity of the Church, which really rails against the church and against the Pope, and shows that there's so many things that are going on that are just not right according to the Bible, just all over the place. And this is getting him into real trouble now, and at this point he needs a protector. So Frederick the Wise, who is the man who set up the university at Wittenberg, really comes to Martin's defence and suggests that actually, rather than allowing himself to go down to Rome and probably to death, he should appeal to the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, who will hear him at a court in a place called Worms, spelt like worms. And this court in Worms, the Diet of Worms, will be a place where Martin can defend himself. So this is now 1521. He makes this journey down to Worms. He's been excommunicated by the church, by the Pope, and so he's now got to make a defence really for his life. So he travels down, even though his friends don't want him to go because they think he'll die, and he goes across Germany, and as he's travelling across Germany, various people are coming out to encourage him. He's obviously got a tremendous following amongst the German people, and he ends up at this council, and he has to stand up and he has to make a defence. And this is famously where he says, it's not safe to go against my conscience. I can't recant, I can't retract what I've said. Here I stand. And that's sort of the moment where he makes his defence. He has to then go away and they have to make a deliberation, but they can't come to a unanimous decision about what to do with Martin Luther. And that really is, that saves him, because if they made a unanimous decision, he would die. He would die as a heretic, be burnt, or he'd be drowned. So he's sent back to Wittenberg, but on the way back to Wittenberg, he gets kidnapped and he's taken off to Wartburg Castle. But he's not kidnapped in a bad way, he's actually kidnapped by Frederick the Wise. And he's put into this castle for safekeeping so that the Pope can't find him, so the authorities can't find him. So he spends a fairly considerable amount of time in isolation in this castle, Wartburg. And it's a difficult time for Martin in many ways. But some good comes out of it, because that's where he translates the Bible from Greek, the New Testament, into German, and so now people can actually read it in their own language. Now, spring of 1522, Martin returns to Wittenberg and starts preaching and saying that monks and nuns should leave their monasteries and priests should get married, and so this happens. One of the nuns who leaves, Catherine, finds her way to Wittenberg, and her and Martin get married and they have a large family, so that's a real blessing for Martin. But there are some things that are going on that Martin is not very happy with. So his ideas about individual responsibility and freedom translate themselves not just from the religious realm, but also into the political realm. So there's an uprising of the peasants, and this is where we get some of the unpleasant things from Martin. As others have said, Martin is really 110% into everything he does. So when he was a monk, he was ultimate monk. When he was doing the writing against the Pope, he was really going for that. And so when this peasant uprising revolt happens, Martin doesn't want this. He thinks this is not right. So he writes against them and says some pretty brutal things. He writes some stuff about the Jews and some pretty unpleasant things there too. And also, quite famously, writes a lot about his toilet habits, which is not great. But so he's definitely got feet of clay. He's not perfect in any way. But there are certain things that come from Martin Luther that are just so good. One of the things that I love about Martin more than anything else is just how down-to-earth he is. He just talks in normal language about all sorts of things. So his sermons and the things he writes about the Bible are really very easy to understand, and he's worth reading. And when he's good devotionally, he is absolutely superb. His engagement with God and relationship with God is just wonderful. But he is just a man, but we are thankful to God for him.